My name is Katie Garner. I am faculty at the Family Medicine Residency and Medical Director for the Simulation Center at Fort Belvoir Community Hospital in Northern Virginia. Today I'd like to talk about learning event design and development for graduate medical education. We will discuss the initial considerations when tasked to design an event. We'll review the methodology behind learning events, roll into the planning cycle, and then close with experiential pearls. Leclerc and Pume in the 8 learning events model and its principles describes a learning and teaching event as a joint combination of what the learner is doing in addition to what the faculty or educator is doing, and how these actions are complementary and interdependent in the learning environment. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts. Let's outline the basics. You're faculty, you're tasked by your program director or you're the medical director, and you're tasked by your commander to come up with a learning event, whether it's to address a sentinel event or an educational event. There are 6 things that you need to consider, and I would encourage you to talk with your commander, your PD, whoever's coming to you, to briefly understand all of these 6 things so that then you can go back, if you're lucky, to your core design team, or if you're unlucky, back to your desk to work out the specifics afterwards. Those 6 things are who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who's your target audience? What? Exercise construct, or what the educational event is to be. When? So what's the critical timing? What needs to happen before, during, and after the event? Where is it going to take place? What venue? In situ training on labor and delivery, in the classroom, or are you doing it out in the woods? Why? And this fundamentally is the most important step early on in the design process, as it will guide further planning. So spend lots of time on this. Lastly is the how. So what methodology is going to allow those objectives to be learned by the residents. So looking at the who considerations, what level or level of training is your target learner? Are they first years, second years, third years, fourth years, or even staff members? What specialties or professions are going to be involved in the training? If you need to improve your postpartum hemorrhage rates on labor and delivery, you're going to need to design events that includes your techs, your nurses, your physicians, potentially your lab, or your OR techs if you need to be opening ORs quickly. Who is going to be involved? The other thing that's important to look at is what level of performance is going to be expected of that learner. And we'll talk about that later, of finding that sweet spot to challenge but not overwhelm the learner. But in order to do that, you need to know where they should be in their level of professional development. Next is the what consideration. So which exercise or event is really going to offer the best learning environment to meet the objectives? Perhaps that is an OSCE. So let's say you need a summative event to see whether or not a learner can progress from the PGY1 to PGY2 year, where they're going to be expected to deal with all those emergencies in the middle of the night quickly and stabilized before calling you because you're at home. Or let's say that you want the learners to be reading up, looking at all this information, and then bring it to the learning event, where then they go in a collaborative effort to address other cases or scenarios in a team-based learning event. Or let's say you want to do field training exercise or in-hospital mass cows to test your systems and also to test the residents' performance outside of a resource-rich hospital and into where many of our military providers are going, where there's limited resources. Also looking at traditional morning reports or procedural skills simulation, if that's actually going to be the best learning environment. Next, you want to look at the when and the where. So as far as the when, faculty and learners alike have a very robust schedule. They are moving in and out of different rotations across the hospital and sometimes across the geographic area. You need to know when the maximum amount of faculty and learners and the right type of learners and faculty can train while still meeting the service obligations. You also need to look at, let's say, the time of the day. So oftentimes many of the specialists are going to have lighter workloads in the afternoon, which would be a great time to pull your residents back in for a training event. The other thing to look at is time of academic year. So again, if you're going to do a progression OSCE, you want to do it at the end of the year so that it's a summation, but you also probably want to do it at least 2 months out from the end of the year. So if you recognize any deficits, you have time to remediate and train. And hopefully you've had enough evaluations throughout the year that you've already identified this, but just in case. The other thing is looking at the timing of certain training events within residency curriculum. So if you've been working the whole last week on cardiovascular stuff, then timing the simulation event at the end of the week to go over GXTs and EKG reading and CHF exacerbation management scenarios would be appropriate. Next, you want to look at the where, so you define the space needed. If you're going to do a large didactic session for all of the residents and you have a large program like ours where you've got 45, you need a large classroom in order to do that. If you want to do a skills testing where you're reviewing profiles and regulations of various services and looking at how you would profile or MEB those various medical conditions within the services, you probably want to do it in a computer lab so that they have the ability to look up all the answers like you would in real life, especially in a specialty like family medicine, where sometimes it's knowing where to look it up and not having everything memorized on the top of your head because it's not possible. The other thing about space considerations is if you're going to do a rotational kind of round robin type exercise that allows you to break up those larger groups into smaller manageable groups so you can have more active learning and engagement, but keep in mind that that will also affect the number of faculty that are required for the event. Other where consideration is in situ training. So oftentimes if you do in situ training on the wards, you're able to get those big teams together, as well as a lot more buy-in from command as well as the learners. And one of the reasons is because it limits the amount of time away from direct patient care. Another consideration is that when you're practicing some of these code drills, such as like a postpartum hemorrhage on labor and delivery, you have everybody working in the environment which they will work and need to perform when the time comes. So you can actually check some of those system issues, like how long does it take them once it is recognized that it's a postpartum hemorrhage in order to go get all the materials and bring it into the room? How can your unit optimize that? So just things to think about. Next, again, why considerations. And in your early stage of planning, you got to look at the learning objectives because it will guide you as you go further along in your planning. So some common goals or learning objectives is that you expose the residents to high-risk, low-volume scenarios. That's also a good source of simulation training when you're talking about team and even staff physician. Another thing that's really important when you look at learning objectives is maybe you need to have a means to assess and evaluate learners on various milestones. Often professionalism and communication can be very hard to garner from end of rotation evaluations, but if you design a simulated scenario where you can manipulate various factors, you'll be able to better march out where that learner is on the milestones. Other things that are good objectives are assessing competency, using deliberate practice to train to mastery, and then one of the unique things that we do in our program is to provide the opportunity in experiential learning for an occupational need. For example, our residents, when they graduate, are going to be in charge of a clinic, and they may very well have to deal or counseling that coworker who's just got back from deployment, showing up shoveled, got tons of patient complaints, and is drinking alcohol. How do you counsel them? How do you limit their practice? Do you limit their practice? Do they have a wellness program at the facility? And then two, also navigating interactions with commanders. If you've got a line service member who's sick, what can you communicate to the commander? What can't you? And if it's the family member who's sick, what are you allowed to communicate and what not, if that family member's health is directly impacting that service member's job? And the goal is that our learners are exposed to these things, they get to practice, see what it's like, be thinking about what they would do before it even happens. And then another thing is, training teams to improve the efficiency, decrease response times, such as in code drills. How considerations. How are you going to teach the learner? So are you going to have them do any independent learning before the event so that the actual event is just practicing and applying the knowledge, not learning it initially and processing? Are you going to have them watch a video of the procedure before they come so they can just practice the procedure when they get there? And the other thing is using the appropriate mode of learning. So are you going to do quizzes? Are you going to do deliberate practice, collaborative work, going through a scenario? If you're using simulation, are you going to do a paper case, task trainer, use a high fidelity mannequin, or standardize patients? So kind of expanding on the how using learning theory. So again, in that same paper, 8 learning events model and its principles, I've highlighted here the relationship between the student and the educator that is best used, in my opinion, in medical education today. So the first one is the educator is modeling how to do the procedure, modeling how to perform a history and physical, and then the learner or student is imitating it. Classic see one, do one, teach one. Reception and transmission. This is more characteristic of didactics or morning report type style education. The educator transmits the information, and hopefully the learner receives the information. When we talk about precepting in the clinic, on the wards, supervising different procedural things, the learner is exercising, practicing, using those skills, and the educator's role is in providing guidance, ensuring that the patient is still safe while the learner is practicing. The other 2 things that I've highlighted here at the bottom of the slide best correlate with simulation. So the first is experimentation, going through the scenario, your faculty changing the variables, changing the patient's physiology based on the learner's inputs. Next is facilitating an appropriate debriefing, where the facilitator is encouraging that learner to self-reflect, to evaluate their performance, so that just like in the aviation industry, they can debrief themselves following every event. And then if the learner has not come to those conclusions or reflected in the manner that the educator feels is important, then they can co-reflect and get them back on track to those learning objectives. So looking at the student's perspective, like I said before, didactics, they receive. They imitate, see one, do one, teach one. They're practicing with the evaluator offering guidance beside them. Experimentation is classic for simulation. Exploring, that's more of those PICOS and evidence-based, where they have a question, they go to the literature, they research it, and then you can say they create when they provide an educational event for other learners. Now let's get down to the planning of an event. The event design process has these 4 components: planning, preparation, execution, and assessment. And honestly, assessment is one of those key things that is often missed or overlooked, but is very important for that event to continue to evolve and become better and more pertinent to your learners and faculty every time you do it. Key points: plan the time for development and rehearsal, and really maximize that faculty-student evaluation debriefing following OSCEs when they're fresh, so that you can write up the written feedback to the learners and provide it in a timely manner. So looking at planning, what we've discussed before, you define the event and define the exercise. With the development of the scenarios, they are developed to meet your training objectives. You develop a tool to evaluate those training objectives. You identify personnel in a core team, the exercise or event planning group, and required supporting organizations. So you have your core team, like with our field training exercises, the PD, the simulation administration, the medical director, the sim center. Then you have your event planning group that incorporates your enlisted personnel leadership as well as your hospital operation gurus. And then when your supporting organizations are those that contribute the vehicles from your line units in the area, or coordinating simultaneous hoist training with the local guard helicopter unit at the same time you're doing yours to improve realism. Preparation. You're going to send out the request for personnel and outline the training required by those personnel before the event. I.e., you have your moulage team that you request from your enlisted service, and then the moulage team has to attend such training before the event. Standardized patients requests often need 2 months lead time. You're going to procure all the necessary equipment, and then you're going to procure the disposables required. Ensure all facilitators are aware of learning objectives and roles. This is the time where you're going to do rater training for any of your high stakes testing. You're going to develop pre-work for the learners if it's required, review the rules of engagement. You're going to troubleshoot and rehearse your scenarios. Keep in mind that more complex, more high fidelity mannequins involve a greater amount of rehearsal time. During your preparation and planning design, you're going to keep in mind all of the phases in Kolb's experiential learning theory, particularly if you're doing a simulation event. In the active experimentation, let's take an NRP, neonatal resuscitation program. So the learner is learning about the neonatal resuscitation program. They're learning about the physiology behind it. They may be running through various steps of learning how to intubate, learning how to put in a UVC, umbilical vein catheter, and then you create a concrete experience where they have to do all of that while managing the nurse and the respiratory tech. Following the event, you offer time for reflection that is facilitated through adequate debriefing with the evaluator. After that, you can then offer the conclusions of the learning objective by your evaluator, or you put it on the learner to then extrapolate to and make the knowledge they garnered from that specific event into something more generalizable that will help them cement the knowledge. To round it out, the execution, again, psychological, physical safety orientation in the beginning. Review the event objective. You're going to go over the exercise or learning event completion to its completion with the debriefing, which is going to enhance the impact of training and reinforce training objectives. Assessment. You're going to evaluate, analyze, and improve. In that assessment, you're going to collect after-action inputs from your learners, your faculty, and if you're lucky, external observers. You're going to perform an internal exercise review amongst your design team and planning group. Then going to review the lessons learned and have some means of improvement tracking. If time allows, you really want to rework those scenarios, change event documentation to reflect those improvements shortly after the event, so that the next time when you got to do it again, for example, with our field training exercises twice a year, you're already set and ready to go for the next one. There is an app that I found that can help with the, it's called ID Sim by De Novo. It's the instructional design of a simulation improved by monitoring. It looks at your curriculum and kind of assesses the composition of the following 10 categories so that you can see where your strengths and weaknesses of your particular program lie. So in closing, whenever you're tasked in order to make an event in graduate medical education, you want to outline your learning objectives first and foremost. Review those 6 categories: who, what, where, when, why, how. Know your audience. Who is going to be your learner? Who are the end users of those evaluations? Your faculty, your PD, the clinical competency committee. Plan time to develop and rehearse. If the event is a summative assessment, plan time for faculty briefing of learners and time to write up written feedback to learners and reports to the clinical competency committee so that all of the information allayed is fresh, is closer to real time, and can be returned to the learner in a time-sensitive manner. And last, share the load and do your best to make it worth everyone's precious time. I hope that this has been a good overview of some of the things to consider when you are designing a learning event. It cannot possibly cover everything that you need to know, but hopefully provides a framework for your future endeavors. Thank you.